Hello my dear sewing friends, it's Alisa here, and today on Made from Scraps we're going to be working with lace and with knits. I might throw in a little bit of a sweater knit in the mix as well, but that's not for sure, so we'll see how that goes. But as you can see for right now, I have already sorted my fabric scraps, and all of them are of this white, off-white, and creamy kind of color scheme. Now with those colors, you gotta be really careful because although they sort of all belong to one, they don't always look good together. I would say that sometimes I even find it way easier combining highly contrasting colors just because then you don't really have to take into account the subtleties of a tone of a color, like in this case. Now I've laid these out here on the table so that way I can sort of take a look at what I have and then get that creative process going. Now most of these came from Fab Scrap and these are fabric samples. Now I did a full video part 1 where I discuss 5 different places where I get my fabric scraps, so I will leave that link for the video in a description, so if you want you can check it out. However, this larger remnant came from a different place. It is actually a hemp knit, and I know that right now it looks rather large, but it's actually only about 19 to 20 inches in length as a remnant. So as you can see, it's not enough for a full length pattern piece for a comfortable wear. And in width, it is actually the width of the entire fabric, and it is a tubular knit, so 29 inches, but there's 2 layers of it. And I'm thinking to combine it with some of the chunkier knits that I have here. I specifically have my eye on this one. I think the colors match really well. I would probably make this into a sleeve and this into a bodice, but as I mentioned, I don't have enough length to make this a full length top or sweater. And here, just by looking at it, I can already tell you that there's not enough for 2 sleeves. So if I was to make it work, what would I do about it? Option number 1, which is great for working with fabric scraps when you don't have enough for the bodice, is to go for a raglan sleeve design. It's because I'm actually wearing a raglan sleeve right now. It's because part of the shoulder right over here is taken by the sleeve, but then you have to make sure that you have enough length for a raglan sleeve, because then of course the sleeve is going to be longer. All right, let's put it on myself, do a little test. So looking at this, raglan sleeve is possible. I still don't have enough fabric to do the bottom of the sleeve, although if I do stretch it, it sort of does come together, but not comfortably, so that still needs to be figured out. And over here, if I go for a raglan sleeve, we can see that I would probably end up with a rather big cuff, which can be a really beautiful design element, so it isn't always a problem, but something to keep in mind. So this could be an option. Option number 2 would be working just with a regular set-in sleeve, but cut the bodice and separate it into the shoulder yokes, which would then give us ability to cut the pattern pieces from shorter amounts and then put them back together to make a full one. I use this trick very often when making clothes from fabric scraps for the entire family, and it works really great. And just recently in one of the videos, I explained the process and the mechanics of separating the bodice into the shoulder yoke. So if you want to see how it's done, you can follow the link in the description. Right now, for my current project, I have to come to a decision of what pattern to use and if I have enough fabric. And I have decided to go for the same pattern that I used for this sweater, also made from a knit fabric scrap and from a lace scarf. This is a sweater pattern derived from my knit bodice block. I have tutorials for all of them. The bodice here fits just right into the length of the knit, so that will be all right. But then I have just a little bit left to figure out everything else. And the main culprit here is the sleeve. As you can see, it's barely enough for one sleeve, but I actually want to squeeze out 2 sleeves out of it, right? So first I started by folding in the length, so that way I can fit in the entire length of the sleeve in it. And then I started finagling around and seeing how much I can decrease from the sides of the sleeve, so that way I can slice it up in multiple pattern pieces. So that way the top part of the sleeve would be out of this lace knit and the bottom part would be out of knit that I'm using for the bodice. The result is sort of this like a 2-piece sleeve, but in a different kind of way than a traditional 2-piece sleeve. Now, of course, I have to double check if I can cut these pattern pieces out of the knit. And here's the thing, is that not only I have to cut these bottom pattern pieces for the sleeve, I also need to cut the bottom band for the bodice as well. And I don't think I have enough fabric here to do all of that. And then of course I did a little tissue test, you know, where I placed the new sleeve like this, and then I'm thinking, well, is this too much of the bottom part that would be just a solid knit and not enough of the lace? And then I kind of got a little bit self-conscious about that. And then while I was sort of dealing with this whole situation, I looked at it and I thought to myself, wait a second, why am I so set on the sleeves? Why am I so set on using this just for the sleeves? And kind of in a moment of thinking, yeah, why am I so set on it? like I'm not even considering any other options, right? I took it and then I placed it on top of the front. It decided to run away. I placed it on top of the front pattern piece, and guess what? It fits perfectly, just enough to cut out the front pattern piece. And that would give me enough space of cutting 2 full sleeves, enough for the bottom band, and for everything else. So maybe I'll go with this option. This lace on its own is quite see-through, so if I'm using it for the bodice, I will need to line it just for my personal comfort. And I decided to go through my stash of offcuts, and I found this really lightweight vanilla colored knit that is going to be just perfect for the job. Next step is of course to start cutting out the pattern pieces. Despite the fact that I've kind of really changed directions of where I started to where I'm going now, I think this is a great example of how sometimes we get that tunnel vision. We are so focused on only that single solution that we disregard any other solutions that might be right there in front of our noses. So it's kind of funny now, but I'm still wondering, like, why did I not consider this option? From the cream color knit, I'm starting by cutting out just the back pattern piece of the bodice, and I am cutting it a little bit larger since I don't add seam allowances as I draft my patterns, but I do add them as I cut the fabric. In this case, it's 3/8 of an inch. Now, usually I use a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance for most of the knit garments that I work with, because 1/4 of an inch is just about the width of a regular 4-thread stitch on my serger. But in this case, as I mentioned, I'm going for 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we are going to dive into this a little bit deeper in the upcoming Members Extra deep dive for this particular project. We're also going to discuss how to determine a fabric content, or at least approximate content, by using a burn test if you're just not sure about what kind of fabric that is. Because as you know, it's really important to be able to combine 2 fabrics together with similar care instructions and similar properties. I'm also going to answer some of the questions that you members of the channel have. So definitely tune in into this Members Extra deep dive and to many others, and check out all of the other members perks. There's plenty, and thank you so much for all of your support, because your support is what makes all of this possible. Now, if you're not a member of this channel and you're wondering, wait a second, what is this all about? Then what you can do is you can click on the join button right underneath this video, and you can watch the membership trailer. That will give you a better idea if this is something that you would like. Now we can move on to cutting the front pattern piece, and that's where the struggle begins, because the knit itself is quite chunky and it's also quite see-through. So usually when I work with chunky knits, what I'll do is I would interface the seam allowance where I'm going to cut, and then I cut it so that way the interfacing holds everything together and the knit doesn't unravel. I use this trick quite often, and you can see how it works right here where I made this gray and yellow zip sweater from an IKEA blanket. In this case, however, the knit lace is see-through and I'm really risking any of that interfacing showing through. So I think I'm gonna opt out of that, and I'm just going to work as careful as I can. I also want to reuse the bottom ribbing for the neckline because I don't think that I will have enough fabric of the other knit for that. So I'm going to start by really carefully cutting off that ribbing. After that, I'm going to proceed by cutting out the front pattern piece, and I'm going to move it and touch it as little as possible so that way I don't risk of unraveling any of the yarns. Now on one hand, I could have done a basting stitch on all of the edges of the pattern so that way the yarns stay in place, but I did not find that to be useful because I did try it on a small scrap of fabric and it just didn't really work. So it is what it is. For the sleeves, I simply had to reassemble the pattern that I sliced up and then cut them out of that cream hemp knit. However, I still couldn't cut the full length of the sleeve that I would like, so we'll definitely need to figure out the cuff situation. To start putting it all together, I'm taking the lining knit, opening it up flat, and then taking my lace knit and very carefully placing it on top, aligning at all of the edges. After that, I'm taking the back pattern piece of the bodice, placing it right sides together with the front, again aligning at all of the seams, and then I'm going to start by basting it. I am basting by hand, and in this case I really don't have any time after that to spend taking out those basting stitches out, so I'm using one of my favorite tricks, and that is a water-soluble thread. I know this thread seems kind of weird, but for this kind of application it's absolutely great. It's sturdy enough to keep the basting in place throughout your entire project, and then after you're done and wash your project, which I do anyway, the thread just dissolves in water and you don't have to worry about taking out those basting stitches. After that, I can start by serging the seams that I basted, the shoulder seams and the side seams. And once that is done, give them a really good press. The next step is to baste in and then sew in the sleeves. The basting part I'm once again doing with a water-soluble thread. Now usually taking out the basting stitches is not a problem at all, but when you're working with really fluffy knits, they tend to absorb stitches really well, and then finding those basting stitches can be a little bit of a time-consuming thing. That's the reason why I opt for this step. When the sleeves are in, we can move on to the neckline. And here I'm going to start by using just a regular white thread and joining the ends of the ribbing in a really nice, flat, and an invisible way. When complete, I'm going to then pin the neckline in first, and after that, of course, baste it. To sew in the neckline, I'm actually opting for a straight stitch on a sewing machine first because I only want the ribbing visible, not the other part. So sewing machine gives me a better control of that. And because I am working with knits, I'm actually going to be using Eloflex or Maraflex, which is a stretchy thread that you put in the bobbin and up top, and it produces a stretchy seam. Instead of that, you can also use a lightning stitch on your sewing machine or a really shallow zigzag stitch. So definitely plenty of options in order to do this. When the seam is done, then I'm going to finish all of the raw edges on the serger. And as the final touch, on the back neckline, I'm going to do a top stitching with the same stretchy thread in order to catch the back neckline and the seam allowance, so that way everything is nice and flat. And in the front, because I don't want top stitching to be visible, I'm actually going to use hand sewing stitches to keep that seam allowance down. Now onto the bottom band and the cuffs for the sleeves. And as you can see, I don't really have much to work with. I only have these tiny little scraps left. I do have one larger one, but the problem is that in order to make it work, I will have to cut it sort of like against the grain on the cross. Luckily, it does stretch in both directions. A little bit less on the cross grain, but still quite stretchy. So I think I can make it work. I'm going to start by cutting and separating this piece into two. One will be for the bottom band and the other one I will use for the cuffs. Actually, I still don't have enough fabric to cut the bottom band and the cuffs for the sleeves on the fold, the way that you would in any other situation. So I do have a little trick up my sleeve that we're going to use a little bit later. So right now you can see me fiddling around with the cuffs and seeing how little I can get away with, what would be enough in order to sort of be on my wrist comfortable enough, and also utilizing as little fabric as I can. Once I have cut my rectangles for the cuffs, I'm reaching for an additional piece of fabric, sort of like the backing for the cuffs. This one is just a really nice beige, slightly on the thicker side cotton jersey. To start, I'm going to cut it the same size as both of my cuffs. To assemble it, first I'm going to sew the top side of the cuff, and I'm doing it once again with a straight stitch with a stretch thread in my sewing machine, because after that is done, I want to be able to press the seam allowance flat so that way it doesn't create a bump once the cuff is done. Then of course we're going to sew the long end of the cuff, creating a tube. After that, just as always, we're going to fold it in half, but this time I want the backing fabric, the other knit, to be sticking out just a little bit, so that way the seam isn't on the actual edge but on the inside of the cuff, being less visible. And then you can just cut off whatever is sticking out without a problem. With the cuffs being ready, I can now attach them onto the sleeve. And of course, in order to complete the bottom band, I'm going to repeat all of the same steps as I did for the cuffs. And now, after all of that, let's take a look at the final result. At a first glance, such a simple make, right? But once you know the ins and outs and how it came together, I think it truly shows you that you can do a lot with fabric scraps. And I also feel that I did pull out a lot of tricks to make this happen. So I truly hope that all of the tips and all of the explanations were not only inspirational, but also practical and will come in handy next time you want to make something beautiful from your fabric scraps, from your fabric remnants, something that you're going to wear and love. Thank you so much for watching. More made from scraps projects will be right over here. I have an entire playlist just of projects like these for you. Until next time, happy, thoughtful sewing. I'll see you soon. Bye!